I would like you now to take these lines and see if you can draw.
Welcome back to The Life with the Browns, where silence is no longer just a reaction, it's a strategy. And this time, that silence is coming from a man who once built his entire identity on being heard. Kody Brown isn't explaining himself anymore. He isn't defending, correcting, or even attempting to control the narrative the way he used to. Instead, he's shutting down, refusing to share details, pulling away from conversations that once fueled the entire show. But this isn't strength. It's not peace either. It's pressure. The kind of pressure that builds when everything around you starts slipping out of your control, and you realize that no amount of talking can fix what's already breaking. Because behind that refusal to speak lies something much deeper, something heavier than just family drama. There's a shift happening, and it's not emotional, it's structural. The kind of shift that affects everything: the money, the image, the lifestyle. Rumors are no longer just gossip floating around fan pages. They're connecting dots, forming patterns, revealing cracks that were always there but carefully hidden behind edited scenes and controlled narratives. And at the center of it all stands that Arizona mansion, the one Cody once treated like a trophy, like proof that his choices worked. But now, that same house feels different. It doesn't represent success anymore. It feels like a burden, a weight, a reminder of something he can no longer sustain the way he used to. Because what happens when the image you spent years building starts turning against you? What happens when the symbol of your success becomes the evidence of your downfall? Cody may not be speaking, but everything around him is. The silence, the distance, the sudden pullback, it all points to one thing. Something is wrong. And this time, it's not something that can be fixed with words. Where what once looked like a complicated but functioning system is now being re-examined as something far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. There was a time when it all seemed to work, at least on the surface. For homes, multiple relationships, children growing up within a shared structure that, despite its chaos, still had moments of connection. Family gatherings, laughter, shared milestones, those were the moments viewers held on to, believing that somehow, against all odds, this unconventional lifestyle had found a way to survive. But survival and stability are two very different things. And now, looking back, those moments feel less like proof of success and more like temporary distractions from problems that were already forming beneath the surface. Because while the cameras captured smiles and togetherness, there were decisions being made behind the scenes, financial choices, emotional priorities, shifts in loyalty, that would slowly begin to reshape everything. Cody stood at the center of it all, presenting himself as the leader, the provider, the one holding everything together. But leadership isn't just about control, it's about balance. And somewhere along the way, that balance was lost. The structure that once seemed strong started leaning too heavily in one direction. Resources, attention, time, all of it began concentrating in ways that created distance instead of unity. And now, that imbalance is impossible to ignore. The same viewers who once watched with curiosity are now watching with clarity. Because the signs are no longer subtle. The changes are no longer hidden. Something has shifted in a way that can't be undone. The family isn't just evolving, it's unraveling. And the house, the relationships, the entire system Cody built, it's starting to feel less like a foundation and more like something that was never as stable as it appeared. Where the idea of success is now being questioned in ways it never was before. Because for years, Cody didn't just live this lifestyle, he sold it. He presented it as something powerful, something functional, something that worked despite the criticism. The homes, the land, the future plans, especially that vision of building something massive on Coyote Pass, it all painted a picture of growth, of expansion, of a man who was not just surviving, but thriving in a system most people couldn't even imagine handling. But now, that image is being challenged by something much more concrete than opinions or emotions: financial reality. Because while Cody continued to speak about loyalty, betrayal, and family dynamics, something else was happening quietly in the background. Bills were stacking. Obligations were growing. And the foundation supporting that entire image was starting to weaken. The Arizona property, once seen as a symbol of everything he had achieved, is now surrounded by questions. Not loud, obvious ones, but subtle, persistent ones. Changes in records. Delays. Movements that don't align with the image being presented publicly. And that's where things start to shift from speculation to concern. Because when actions don't match the narrative, people start paying attention. And that attention is revealing something Cody can't easily control. The empire he built may not be as solid as it once appeared. In fact, it may be far more fragile, held together not by stability, but by momentum. And now that momentum is slowing down. The relationships that once fueled the show are fading. The voices that once supported the story are stepping away. And without those elements, the entire structure begins to look different. Less like a success story, and more like something that was always on borrowed time. Where the spotlight that once built this empire is now exposing every hidden crack in painful detail. Because if you really want to understand what's happening, you don't just listen to what's being said, you look at what's being done. And lately, what's being done tells a story far more serious than any on-screen drama. Quiet movements. Subtle changes. The kind that don't make headlines immediately, but once noticed, can't be ignored. The Arizona mansion, once Cody's proudest display of success, is now surrounded by whispers of behind-the-scenes adjustments. Not bold announcements, not confident expansions, but quiet shifts that suggest something is off. Because when a property starts being treated less like a home and more like a financial tool, people start asking questions. And those questions are growing louder. Fans aren't just watching episodes anymore. They're digging deeper, connecting dots, analyzing patterns that don't align with the image Cody continues to project. Delayed payments. Ownership adjustments. Movements that hint at pressure building behind closed doors. And here's where the irony hits hardest. The same man who once proudly showcased his lifestyle, who turned his family into a symbol of strength and unity, is now facing a situation where the strongest symbol he has left, the house, is becoming his biggest vulnerability. Because a home is supposed to represent security, stability, control. But when that home starts carrying financial weight instead of emotional meaning, everything changes. It stops being a symbol of success and starts becoming evidence of struggle. And for someone like Cody, whose entire identity was built on control, that shift is devastating. Because you can't control numbers. You can't control records. And you definitely can't control the truth when it starts revealing itself piece by piece. Where the illusion of luxury is starting to fade, revealing something much more complicated underneath. For years, Robyn's house stood as the centerpiece of Cody's world. Bigger, better, more secure, it wasn't just a place to live, it was a statement. A clear, undeniable message about where his priorities were. While the rest of the family navigated uncertainty, rentals, unfinished land, shifting plans, Robyn's home remained untouched by that instability. It looked permanent. It looked safe. It looked like the final destination of everything Cody had been building. But now, that same house is being looked at differently. Not as a reward, but as a risk. Because when financial pressure starts building, even the strongest structures begin to feel unstable. And if the rumors are even partially true, if that property is being leveraged, adjusted, or used to manage growing obligations, then the very thing that once symbolized security may now represent something far more fragile. Because security built on imbalance doesn't last forever. And that imbalance is impossible to ignore. While other relationships were stretched thin, resources appeared to concentrate in one place. Time, attention, financial investment, it all pointed in the same direction. And now, with the family structure collapsing and income streams shifting, the consequences of those choices are becoming visible. The house may still be standing, but the foundation beneath it feels different. Heavier. Less certain. And for Robyn, that shift carries its own weight. Because when everything is tied to one central structure, any instability in that structure affects everything connected to it. What once felt like protection now feels like pressure. What once looked like certainty now feels like a question waiting to be answered. And the biggest question of all is this: was it ever as secure as it seemed? Where numbers are beginning to tell a story that emotions alone never could. Because beyond the arguments, beyond the broken relationships, beyond the shifting dynamics, there's a reality that no one can avoid: financial truth. And that truth doesn't rely on opinions, feelings, or narratives. It's documented, tracked, recorded in ways that can't be rewritten or re-edited. And lately, those records are raising serious questions. Patterns of delayed payments, signs of strain, indicators that something isn't aligning with the image being presented on screen. Because when everything is stable, consistency follows. Payments are made on time. Ownership remains clear. There's no need for sudden adjustments or quiet changes. But when pressure builds, those patterns shift. And that's exactly what people are starting to notice. It's not one isolated incident, it's repetition. A series of small signals pointing towards something larger. And the more people look, the clearer that picture becomes. Because financial strain doesn't appear all at once. It builds gradually, quietly, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be hidden. And when that moment comes, everything changes. The narrative shifts. The perception changes. And the person at the center of it all is forced to face something they can't talk their way out of. Because unlike emotional conflict, financial reality doesn't respond to explanation. It demands resolution. And right now, it's starting to look like Cody is being pushed into that moment. A moment where the image he created is no longer enough to carry the weight of what's actually happening behind the scenes. And if that pressure continues to build, the outcome won't be decided by words or interviews or even the show itself. It will be decided by facts, by records, by a reality that doesn't bend to perception. Where the real collapse didn't start with the wives leaving, it started when the children stopped showing up. Not just physically, but emotionally, symbolically, and most importantly, on camera. Because for years, the heart of this entire story wasn't just Cody, and it wasn't even the marriages. It was the kids. They were the glue, the authenticity, the reason audiences stayed invested even when the adult dynamics became repetitive. Viewers watched them grow up, form opinions, challenge authority, and slowly begin to question the very structure they were raised in. And that honesty, that raw, unfiltered perspective, is what made the show feel real. But now, that element is fading. The appearances are fewer. The energy is different. And when they do show up, there's distance, a kind of emotional separation that can't be edited out. And that absence carries weight far beyond storytelling. Because in reality television, presence equals value. Screen time equals relevance. And relevance equals income. So when the kids step back, it doesn't just affect the emotional core of the show, it hits the financial structure directly. Because suddenly, the content becomes thinner. The storylines become repetitive. And the audience starts losing interest. And here's where the situation becomes critical. If the next generation no longer wants to participate, if they've decided that their lives are worth more than unpaid exposure, then the entire foundation of the show begins to crumble. Because without them, what's left? Repeated conversations about loyalty? Endless reflections on past conflicts? There's only so much of that viewers will tolerate before they tune out completely. And once that happens, the consequences aren't just emotional, they're financial. Because the show isn't just a platform. It's a primary source of income. And if that source weakens, everything connected to it starts to feel the impact. The house, the lifestyle, the image. It all becomes harder to maintain. And suddenly, the absence of the kids doesn't just feel like a personal loss, it feels like the beginning of something much bigger. Where the most unexpected twist isn't the downfall, it's who managed to escape it in time. Because while everything around Cody appears to be tightening, two names continue to rise in complete contrast: Christine and Janelle. And what makes their positions so powerful isn't just that they left, it's when they left. Because timing in situations like this is everything. Christine was the first to step away publicly, and at the time, many questioned how she would manage without the structure she had been part of for so long. But what followed wasn't struggle, it was transformation. She didn't just leave a relationship, she rebuilt her entire identity. Social media, personal branding, independent content, she took control of her narrative in a way that completely shifted public perception. And instead of fading out, she expanded. Meanwhile, Janelle approached things differently, quietly, strategically, without unnecessary noise. She didn't need dramatic exits or emotional confrontations. She simply stepped away when the balance no longer made sense. And now, looking at where things stand, that decision carries a different kind of weight. Because while Cody appears to be dealing with increasing pressure, financial and otherwise, Christine and Janelle exist outside of that structure entirely. They're no longer tied to the same responsibilities, the same expectations, or the same risks. And that separation matters. Because when a system starts struggling, the ones who exited early aren't pulled down with it. They observe from a distance. They move forward while others are forced to deal with the consequences of decisions made years earlier. And that contrast is becoming impossible to ignore. On one side, you have expansion, independence, growth. On the other, contraction, pressure, and uncertainty. And the most striking part of all of this is how unexpected it feels. Because for years, the assumption was that Cody held the power. That everything revolved around him. But now, that narrative has flipped. And the people who were once seen as dependent are now the ones who look the most stable. Where the most powerful voices are no longer coming from inside the system, but from those who have stepped outside of it. Because in situations like this, the real shift doesn't happen when things fall apart. It happens when people start speaking about what was happening all along. And that's exactly what we're beginning to see. The controlled narrative, the carefully managed image, it's being challenged by first-hand experiences that paint a very different picture. And once those perspectives enter the public space, they can't be taken back. They reshape everything. Because suddenly, the story isn't just about a unique family structure struggling to survive, it becomes something deeper. Questions start forming. About fairness. About contribution. About what was given and what was taken. And as more voices emerge, those questions gain weight. Because they're no longer based on speculation, they're based on lived experience. And that changes how everything is viewed. The show, the decisions, the leadership. It all starts to feel different when seen through that lens. And for Cody, that shift is particularly significant. Because the narrative he once controlled is no longer his alone. It's being rewritten in real time by the very people who were once part of it. And that kind of shift is difficult to manage. Because you can't silence independent voices. You can't control how people interpret what they hear. And you definitely can't undo the impact once it spreads. And all of this feeds into the larger situation. Because public perception matters, especially when your platform depends on it. And when that perception begins to change, it affects everything. The audience. The engagement, the long-term viability of the show itself. And suddenly, what once felt secure starts to feel uncertain. Because the story is no longer being told from one perspective, it's being told from many. And those perspectives aren't aligning the way they once did. Where every story eventually reaches a moment it can no longer escape, the moment where image collides with reality, and everything that was once carefully controlled begins to fall apart in full view. And this feels like that moment. Because what we're watching now isn't just drama, and it isn't just another chapter in a long-running reality show. It's something much bigger. It's the unraveling of a narrative that was built over years, piece by piece, episode by episode, decision by decision. A narrative that told us this lifestyle could work, that this man could lead, that this family, despite everything, could hold itself together. But now, standing in the middle of what's left, that belief feels distant. Because the reality looks very different. The family structure that once defined everything is no longer intact. The relationships that once fueled the story have shifted, fractured, or disappeared entirely. And the one thing that was supposed to represent stability, the house, the lifestyle, the foundation, it now feels uncertain. Not gone, but no longer untouchable. And that's the real shift. Because when the symbols start to lose their meaning, everything connected to them changes too. Cody once stood as the center of a world he created, a world built on control, presence, and the belief that he could hold everything together no matter how complicated it became. But control doesn't last forever. And neither does momentum. Because eventually, every system reaches a point where it has to sustain itself without constant force holding it in place. And when that moment comes, the truth reveals itself. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. And what we're seeing now feels like that clarity. A man standing in the aftermath of decisions that can't be undone. A structure that can't be rebuilt the way it once was. And a future that no longer looks the way it was planned. The question now isn't whether things have changed, that much is obvious. The real question is what comes next. Because when everything you built begins to shift, you're left with two choices: adapt or fall with it. And right now, it's unclear which direction this story is heading. But one thing is certain. The version of Kody Brown the world once knew, the confident, in-control patriarch, is no longer the full picture. Something has changed. And whatever comes next won't just define the future of the story, it will define how it's remembered. So the only thing left to ask is this: was this fall inevitable, or was it avoidable all along?